Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
Yes, I am Doug, and I am here again with
Cody and Doug. This is for all of those that love form.
Yes.
This is the body of Christ, part 2, which inevitably means we've split the body.
Yeah. Here we go. That's the way it works, Cody.
That's like a classic preacher line. So
yeah, that's right.
Doug, how you feeling today?
I feel great, man.
Good.
It's a beautiful day, and just so excited to be part of this whole conversation, Cody. And you know how much it's exploding. We are contacted almost daily by folks that want to be part of this conversation. Either they want to participate in it so they can teach it publicly, or they're pastors and leaders of groups right now who are trying to navigate the waters with their particular churches and denominations and take those folks forward.
Well, I just feel like a conversation like this is more relevant than ever. And actually, I'm working on a series right now for our collective over in Mableton. Just because it feels like, particularly as a country, so for our international kind of global listeners, maybe I'm sure they sense this in some level where they are, but particularly where we are right now, that it seems like things are more divided than ever.
Yeah.
Just the body of humanity seems to be just split, be it Democrat or Republican, and then let alone those who are claiming to be the body of Christ, and the arguments and the division. And I spend time on Twitter, and it doesn't take much for anyone to get on any social media network and just see argument after argument, and no one can seem to agree on anything. And part of the dilemma, Doug, is we attach to our truths and our opinions. And as we attach to those things, just like we saw last week, it becomes who we are, which makes us incredibly defensive, because we're no longer defending just an idea. We're defending ourselves because it's become who we are. And that's what we've been talking about. So if you're just joining us, last week, we started this conversation on the body of Christ, and we're talking about, really, we're asking a big question: is Christ divided? And we've looked at particular text, 1 Corinthians 3, which again, you find Paul just saying, here's the thing. Some of you say you follow Paul. Some of you say you follow Apollos. And Paul is frustrated because there's arguments in division, because some are saying, no, Paul's teaching, like that's the teaching, that's the right way. And then some are saying, no, you have Apollos, and that's like the right way. And there's this division because, as we learn, who is Paul? Well, Paul's a biological form. And when you attach to these forms, this is what creates the division.
Yeah, it's not the fact that there's disagreement. That's the whole point of the narrative, that human beings are always going to disagree. Where will unity come from? Unity can only come from spirit as identity, beyond us, beyond anything we do, beyond anything that's of ourselves. Because as human beings, we will always have differences of opinion, different perspectives. And if my God identity is dependent upon my agreement with a certain group, that eliminates all other people from having God identity like I do. And the way I have God identity is by the things I do through self as source, understand through self as source, etc. And so it's not the fact that if you move into this new heaven and earth, that suddenly we don't disagree with each other. No, I mean, we have disagreements. If you're married, you have disagreements in your marriage or with your kids or whatever situations you bring up with best friends, etc. That's not the point. Disagreements and hostilities become a real problem when it involves identity. We're talking about God identity about which there can be no disagreement, that identity is of the Spirit and the Spirit alone, and therefore it is universal. Therefore, every single person on the planet is created in the image of God. Every single person on the planet is God-breathed. Every single person on the planet is the essence of God within these biological forms that we carry. Now, the degree to which I'm conscious of that and what it means will be different than the other 7.5 billion people that are on the planet today. And so it's not ever going to be a case where we will reach this place where we agree on every single thing. And that's why identity must be of the Spirit. That's why unity must be of God, because it can't be of us. And so Paul's concerned, the reason he's freaking out, don't say you're of and then name these things, because you're talking identity when you say of. So, for example, Cody, many times I use the example of God in the statement of identity to Moses, I am that I am. Who do I say you are? I am that I am. So my thinking has been that my identity should be, I am of, I am that I am, therefore I am. I'm being, suchness, thusness. And that's my of statement. I am of, I am that I am. They were saying they were of, and they list Paul, Peter, Apollos, and even Jesus. And Jesus is saying, don't be of me, understand and follow me, the point you made last week, and see the place to which I point, which is God's space. That is the space of identity. Yeah. That's where we've run into a few problems.
Well, okay. Let's back it up for just a minute, because you just said so much. First of all, I want to get back to the point that you just mentioned, that Jesus is pointing to something. So I want to get there. But before we do that, to your point about having disagreements, and that's a part of, you take Twitter, social media, any of these things, again, arriving at a place where you realize exactly what you just said. You just pass by that, because in a time and day where if you disagree with someone, literally we are so attached and have brought identity into it. That's the problem. We can't even disagree with someone without literally attaching their essence and identity to it, which means we're cutting them off. And that's what you see again and again and again throughout family dynamics, throughout international disagreements. And I think, like in ancient Judaism, they had midrash, which is a beautiful thing. And to date, they still practice this, where they'll take a text and one person give an interpretation, the other person give an interpretation, and they'll argue back and forth, but they're never discussing someone's essence and identity. They're saying, yeah, well, okay, I disagree. Now let's have lunch.
Yes, that's great.
What's happening, yes, it feels like more and more, is that we're not able to detach someone's identity and essence with the statements that they're making, or the beliefs or the opinions or whatever else it is that they're saying. And that leads to serious division.
Absolutely. Even the egoic manifestations, our actions in our lives are often interpreted as our identity. My actions are actually an indication whether I am conscious or unconscious of my identity. My actions are not my identity. They are simply a reflection of whether I understand or don't understand my identity. And that's what makes it so very difficult in our reactions, is because in the world of form, you're going to judge. So you look at a person's actions and you judge them to be, and then you give them a label. And what's happening is that you are losing sight. I'm losing sight of the fact that their identity and my identity is the same. And in this particular area that I see that they are causing pain and suffering to people, I may be conscious that they're egoically acting out, so to speak, but it's because they're not conscious of the true spirit of identity that they are. And I then have to also remind myself, and I do in my meditations, that I am just like them in the sense that I do the same thing every day on some level. Now, I'm not disagreeing that there are different levels of acting out that can cause pain and suffering. Some people act out in such a way that they have to be put behind bars in what we call a prison cell. But even that is not their identity. That's why people, our good friend Danny Hawes that's been on here, that's why they do prison ministry. The whole point is to let them know that the way they egoically acted out in some type of violence, fraudulence, or whatever they've done to go to those prison cells, that's not a reflection of their identity. It's a reflection of their unconsciousness of their identity. And in that sense, that really helps me to understand why Jesus could forgive people on the basis of their unconsciousness. They know not what they do. It helps me understand how I can be more empathetic. And so when we're looking at the source of our identity, the question becomes, is it anything other than purely the Spirit of God? And if it involves me in any way, shape, or form, and something that I have achieved, something I'm maintaining, there's always going to be a problem and division.
Man. And like if you're a parent listening, that's just so rich for even how we raise our kids. I was just thinking about like this group of people that gather that I had the privilege to kind of lead and teach, and so many of them have kids, and so many of my friends are just the age I'm at right now have kids, and the big question is like, how are we raising them? Particularly, they listen to this podcast, and they're just like, so much of my beliefs are changing and shifting, and I don't know what to hand off to my kids, what not to hand off to my kids, what do I believe, what do I not believe, and I've always told them, and so much of what you just said is true, is that, man, if we can just look the next generation in the eyes and just remind them of who they are, just keep telling them, well, this is who you are.
Yeah.
And you may not be conscious of it at this point in your life, but just keep reminding them. It's almost like just keep whispering in their ear, yep, this is who you are, and nothing will ever change that.
Beautiful.
Man, that's great news.
It's wonderful news. I guarantee you, every person out there listening to this who's a parent loves your child. It doesn't matter if we're talking to someone whose child has run into problems with the law, who may have a child who's in that prison cell, or perhaps in a rehab center, or who knows where else. That doesn't change your heart's love and desire for them. It doesn't change it. It breaks your heart. It causes pain and suffering from that standpoint. But if we can all understand that that child is beautiful, that is the image of God, and the issues and challenges are surrounded by unconsciousness of that beauty that they already are, that essence they already are, then we can continue to support them by letting them know that they are perfect, they are beautiful, as opposed to saying, you're far from that, and here's a whole list of things you need to do in order to get my approval or my judgment of you to say now you're where you should be, and therefore that brings us to the subject of acceptance. And all of those things, Cody, as you just said, lead us to therapist's office, and lead us to family divisions and the ways that we even have black sheep in a family, and so on and so forth. It's because we are, again, putting labels on people that unfortunately become an identity, and that is, again, always going to lead to a separation issue. Problem.
I was thinking as you were talking, two great moments. One, again, the transformative Jesus. Think about this. Early in the Gospels, he's getting baptized. You remember this moment? He gets baptized, and then like a dove descends or whatever, and then this voice. This is before Jesus ever did anything as it pertains to his ministry, before Jesus ever did any good on this planet, this voice from the heavens, "This is my son, in whom I am well pleased." That passage is actually personal for me on a lot of levels, but it is a statement that I want to read over everyone, those incarcerated, those who have in some way or another done something that their family has attached that identity to them, like this is who you are. That it's like the divine voice just continually whispers, "You are my son, you are my daughter, in whom I am well pleased."
Oh, that's perfect. So powerful. And here's the thing, our egoic mind, our egoic self that gives most of the time our worst, most severe judgment. If I say to everyone in a room, close your eyes and hear the voice of God say to you what Cody just said, "You are my beloved son, you are my beloved daughter, in whom I am well pleased." Many of you are going to have a voice that comes back immediately that says, no, but I messed up. But you don't know what I've done. You don't know who I am. You don't know what circumstances I've created in pain and suffering and whatever. And it actually becomes a very difficult thing for a person to understand that, because the adversary, the satanic adversarial mind, is the ego that says, but wait a minute, how can you be well-pleasing to God when you violated all those boundaries and created all those problems and heartaches and trouble? You can't be that. You're really not that at all. In fact, you're a, quote, bad person. You're an evil person. You're this person. So this whole concept that we're talking about as we get into the role and function of the body of Christ, and the reason we walk in its light is because it enlightens us on this very conversation we're having now, and that is, how do we relate in the bodies, which is to say the faith communities in which we interact. And some of those communities are our own families. Some of them have to do with neighborhoods, and some of them have to do with groups of people who get together and study with us, Cody, out of the biblical narrative at certain times. All of them are faith communities. We don't restrict that faith community to a form, like, day of the week, a building, etc. So yeah, the ramifications of this, Cody, are just far, far reaching.
I want to go back, Doug, to 1 Corinthians for a minute, because you had Paul who's addressing this, because obviously they were of Paul, of Apollos, of Cephas. All of these conversations Paul is addressing, but then we talked a little bit about even those that say of Christ. And one of the large statements in the last episode was they were making Jesus a form rather than seeing Jesus as transform. And I want to talk about the reason we say that's elevating Jesus is because as we see the narrative, Jesus seems to be pointing away from himself towards something. So can you talk to us a little bit about everything seems to be pointing towards something?
Yes. One of the things that starts with Adam is the adversarial stance that was taken toward God by the self attempting to grasp an identity of its own, to be like God, rather than to say, no, I am of God. I am one with God. That doesn't come till Jesus, you see. And so this adversarial position with regard to our God identity, we get that through the ego, and that entered through Adam, and that was the sin of Adam. The sin of Adam is that which separates Adam from his true God identity. And that's carried all the way through the biblical narrative, Cody. So when we're talking about pointing away from the self, that's actually going to bring us all the way down to the message of the cross. For example, in 1 Corinthians 1, again, the first chapter, where Paul is talking to them about the issues that lead to divisiveness, he talks about the cross being the power of God. And that's because everything was to point to God. What was Jesus putting to death? The self. Jesus was this is why he had to have faith, because the self doesn't have faith. The self grasps. The self goes and does what it has to do. It's all about doing. Faith is about trusting that God power is going to ensure that your identity is an eternal one that cannot be taken away. And so the whole story is pointing away from the self to God. You start Genesis 1, in the beginning, God. Then you have God and Adam. Then you have God and Abraham, God and Moses, God and David, God and the prophets, and finally God and Jesus of Nazareth. And every single one of those characters is playing a role and function, which is to point away from themselves to God. Moses, in role and function, provided through Israel a part of this developmental story that involved the tribal age, the warrior age, and the traditional age, and it was a necessary role and function that was played. Moses only became a problem when, instead of following and going on to Christ, they stopped and attached to Moses. Then Moses became a restricted form. And that is why it was important to keep the form markers like circumcision, go to the temple, do the Day of Atonement, offer sacrifices. That was because instead of following Moses to Christ so that Christ could lead beyond himself to the Father, and this is why Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, because Jesus fulfills the end of the journey that delivers all humanity to God for God identity and God identity alone. And so the whole message of the cross, to your point about pointing away from the self, there is no greater way that could be demonstrated than to have a person, Jesus of Nazareth, in a position where he faced biological death, because biological death is the place that the ego stops everything else that's going on in life and attends to that one issue, because nothing else matters other than one's biological continuance. That's the only thing that the ego knows will maintain identity. And any other thought of losing my biological life is complete catastrophe to the ego. That's its job, is to say, warning, warning. And so Jesus is pointing away from the self by going through that cross event. And of course, that reframes the cross itself. But that is why, Cody, you and I are talking, obviously, about pointing away from the self. And if we make the body of Christ a form, who is it that determines whether or not you can be a pastor as a Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, Jehovah's Witness, Seventh-day Adventist, et cetera, times thousands? It's a group of people, human beings, who are given some type of authority. They're called boards, synods, elders, bishops, cardinals, whatever they are. They're given human authority to determine what the boundaries of that denomination are. And you will have to go through some type of ordination process that is approved by human beings. That means you keep some type of confession of faith, interpretation of the word, etc., in order that you may be a pastor, preacher, teacher in that particularism, which is a denomination, which is to say the way you are separated from all others. And so this is why pointing away from the self and the body of Christ is so important, is because when you make the body of Christ a form, you have brought the self right back into the middle of the picture.
I just let you go. I'm like, the church I grew up in, right there would be like, every head bowed, every eye closed. It'd be like giving an invitation. People need to get born again.
Hey, could you take up a contribution then?
Oh, man. Seriously. Yeah. So we can fund this forum. Yeah. Okay. I was thinking about, there was so much that was flying through my head. And by the way, people, just so you know, because you're not in the room, but as he's talking, I'm also on my laptop just writing down riffs and thoughts that are coming to my head. So when I go quiet, I'm literally just like, oh, God, we can't just skip this. So a couple of things. One, again, the 1 Corinthians 3, it's so true. Listen to what he says. This is verse 5 after he talks about, man, some say I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos. He says, what after all is Apollos? God, and that's just a great question. What after all is this biological form, Apollos? What is Paul? Which is funny, if this is Paul writing this, that's great. Only servants through whom you came to believe as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. So check this line out. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow.
Oh, wow. That's pretty clear.
Man.
That's pretty clear where it comes from. That's where identity comes from. That's why you don't say I am of Paul or Apollos. They play role and function. A servant plays a role and a function on behalf of the one served. And so, yeah, this is a beautiful example that Paul draws out about the difference between identity and role and function. And that's where those problems all come in, is when we egoically step past that. And that's what's happened within Christianity. And so that's why you have denominationalism. Now, for a while in the traditional age, Cody, which went all the way up here through the 1900s and still is very much alive and well today in fundamentalism, you can understand how human beings have been attached to that kind of thinking. And then you can also understand that when modernity came in and postmodernity has come in and the millennial generation has come in, and they are no longer afraid of the church doing something. See, when I grew up, people were terribly afraid of being excommunicated, disfellowshipped, declared apostate. The church had a much greater control over that. When I say the church, I'm talking about those in different denominations that were human beings given the power to determine that. So all of those things are really now a point that I think we can leverage off of for continuation of our series on the body, and why we are seeing church buildings empty today, and why we are saying it's obvious it's time for an evolutionary leap beyond the form, Jesus as form, and movement into God as formlessness.
Yeah, and I think that's so crucial because I have walked through this journey personally myself with the collective that I have, and then also, I can't tell you the number of emails and phone calls and conversations that we've already had with spiritual leaders who are also processing this. And it does appear, just even on a global level, that sometimes we're resisting where the universe is headed. It's like if there is a drive or an evolutionary impulse from the beginning, it seems to be moving in a direction where people are starting to wake up either by choice or by force on some levels, because like buildings are emptying and people are having to start to ask some serious questions. Well, what does the future of spiritual collectives look like? We know what it's been, but we also know what's not working. And we try to reform it and reform it and reform it, and we dress it up and we make it look as good and as hip as we can to be relevant. And it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Well, maybe the reason it doesn't work is because we're resisting an evolutionary impulse that's led by Spirit to move us forward. So those are the questions that I want to talk about as we move into the next podcast. What is the future of spiritual collectives? What does that look like? What does it mean for two or more to be gathered? Days of the week, on and on, the list goes. We can talk about that. So I think there's been enough to mess all of our heads up for today. So for those that are listening, thank you again for listening. If you have questions, comments, whatever, don't hesitate to email us. And hope you have a fantastic week. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.